book is on the pre-war and wartime history of Japanese life insurance. Now, upon first hearing this, it might sound like an overly specialized topic. And I hope to, after the talk that, I can demonstrate some of the interest in this topic. Life insurance has played a surprisingly important role in the formation of class subjectivities and the constitution of responsible social life in modern Japan. It is also just monetarily and numerically significant for Japanese society. Japan continues to have one of the largest life insurance markets in the world. It was second to China the last time I checked. But nevertheless, there hasn't been much scholarship on the history of what turns out to have been a fairly significant product in the everyday lives of Japanese people. Sorry, sorry, there we go. Okay, froze for a second. Apologies for that. So here's the outline of the talk. I hope to spend the first part talking about, why I think life insurance is an interesting topic to study. I'll talk about the outline of the book, and then I'll give kind of a slightly more in-depth discussion of life insurance in colonial Korea, which is the 5th chapter of the book, and then I'm happy to open it up to questions. So as is the case with many first books, I initially began this topic many years ago when I was working on my dissertation. And at the time, I was very interested in the importance of science to the larger project of governance in modern societies. I was especially interested in trying to understand the importance of statistics as a modern system of governance and a means for aggregating lives into a coherent and legible object. Statistics, in essence, objectifies life into data that can then be the subject of rational management. This would be part of the familiar story of disenchantment of modernity that we see in figures as diverse as Max Weber or Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. So while I was very interested in thinking through the importance of statistics to modern societies, statistics as a topic itself seemed too big to me, and I was having trouble trying to figure out how to actually make that a feasible topic. And so I ultimately decided on life insurance as it seemed a more concrete way of exploring some of my interests in the statistical management of society. As we see in this table on the screen, life insurance works by trying to calculate the probable future for an aggregate population. It is in many ways centered around the management of data and statistical calculations. In the initial stages of the work then, the scientific management of life was likely the main focus. Over time, however, I began to see some more complexity to the
おはようござい
topic.
ます。何時から
Ron, I think you
Draft
need to mute yourself.
1時 OK。
Ron, you're coming through the talk. Anyway, sorry. So I now see insurance as still related to the scientific management of society, but not just about that. It also entails the history of emotions or affect. And here I should note that I don't just mean affect as equal to emotions, but the pre-subjective or non-subjective ways in which structures of feeling can be embodied. As the project developed, I realized that instead of statistical rationality, individuation, or even governance, the key theme that united the different parts of my book was actually community and the affective attachments associated with this term. Community, of course, has a long history in Japanese studies. Maruyama Masao would famously argue that Japanese people had failed to develop an internal morality and instead took moral cues from the group. So instead, I try to look at community as a historical assemblage that insurance companies and the state mobilized in different ways at different historical moments. Thus, as this project developed, it became a project related to the management of effective attachments as much as it was about statistics, rationalization, or bureaucracy. This research has also allowed me to think about financialization and the calculative logic that could become enmeshed in patterns of everyday life in modern Japan. Now, it might seem surprising to think of insurance as a way of accessing effective attachments. Insurance, as I suggested earlier, is kind of a banal product. It isn't something about which people have tended to leave lengthy reflections, although there is an interesting anecdote in I Am a Cat where Kashami Sensei says absurd things like nobody needs to insure it unless he's going to die. Aside from this, there really aren't too many great works of literature or film that feature life insurance. So given that insurance is not something about which most people have thought too hard, what do I mean when I say that insurance involves effective management? Moreover, why would insurance be an interesting or an important way of thinking through this topic? Insurance, I argue, becomes a particularly important way of thinking of affect because of how it articulates a vision of the future. The critical theorist Laurent Berlant's concept of cruel optimism became a particularly useful way for me to think about life insurance and the vision of the future that it articulates. According to Berlant, optimism can be cruel when it causes us to accept situations that actually injure us. If we feel stuck or overwhelmed in suboptimal situations, the hope that things will get better shortly is something that keeps us in harmful situations. As I discuss in the text, insurance articulates a vision of a future in a few different ways. So firstly, insurance companies made the argument that their statistical tabulations allowed them to determine the most probable future. While no one individual could ever determine the future solely through their own efforts, companies argued that they alone could determine the likely future for the aggregate. Insurance companies thus argued that their calculations of past mortality data enabled them to better engage in the future and to allow their customers to prosper. Knowing the past, in other words, gave companies the ability to provide a secure future for their customers. In their interactions with customers, Japanese life insurance companies presented life insurance as a way for customers to essentially control the future. By entering into a life insurance contract, the customer, at least in the company's discourse, gained the means to ensure an ideal future for himself and his family. Since Japanese life insurance was associated with savings through the endowment contract, which was a combination of an annuity and a life insurance contract, the customer might also receive a benefit in the future should he live to a long age. If he unfortunately passed away sooner, Japanese insurance salesmen promised that his children would live a life of upward social mobility and comfort. If the customer had a daughter, this meant that she would marry into a wealthy and secure family. If the customer had a son, this meant that he would be able to go to university and go on to work in a nice white-collar position. Of course, university education was only available to a small minority of the population in pre-war Japan. But nevertheless, the insurance salesman presented these idealized futures as almost guaranteed to the families of male household heads who purchased a life insurance contract. Life insurance was thus sold as a way for people to control their future destinies amid a period that saw repeated economic, social, and political disturbances. Private companies and then the state with its postal life insurance system for laborers thus argued that customers could enter into the company's insurance pool in order to shield themselves from the unpredictable nature of the world, or at least unpredictable for the individual. By entering into this aggregate social body, they would receive protection, however. In my book, I refer to the aggregate social body of insurance customers as the community of the insured. I do this to highlight how insurance companies presented insurance as simultaneously an individual action that also brought the consumer into a new system of social relations. This likely seems a different way of thinking about community, which we might often think of in relation to the organic Gemeinschaft version of community that Max Weber articulated, and which scholars have sometimes discussed when thinking about the rise of nationalism in pre-war Japan. Japanese insurance companies wanted to build on the warmth associated with community and systems of mutual aid, while simultaneously using the discourse of community to commodify lives and transform them into an object of governance. To gain access to the community of the insured, customers needed to purchase a life insurance contract, and this required them to adjust their bodily habits in many ways, which might include their approach to family, savings, masculinity, and health. The protection offered by the community of the insured, in other words, functioned as a powerful means of transforming understandings of normative behavior and social life in modern Japan and colonial Korea. The emphasis on the community formed by life insurance customers also provides an important addition to our understanding of the history of the state's intervention into society in pre-war Japan. While there has been quite a lot written on insurance and social welfare in the US and Europe, there has been very little discussion of this in East Asia. In the literature on Japanese history, the standard story is that Japan had very little in the way of public welfare programs, as the government did not want to pay for them. Instead, the government formed relationships with private organizations that then administered aid. As I demonstrate in this book, however, the post office, with its life insurance system, would be an important vector through which the state could intervene in social life in pre-war Japan. When scholars first began discussing the introduction of postal life insurance in the early 1900s, they did so as a response to the social problem that accompanied the expansion of manufacturing in emerging urban areas. As new workers moved into these areas, they felt cut off from social ties that previously existed in neighborhoods or that they might have experienced in villages. Moreover, they also experienced quite a bit of exploitation from factory owners who did not pay them well or forced them to work in unsafe conditions. The first scholars who discussed postal insurance had generally studied in Europe and had learned about the social effects of social insurance while abroad. Back in Japan, they advocated for life insurance as a way of reincorporating laborers into the fabric of the national community. Nevertheless, in contrast to insurance in Europe, life insurance in Japan would have some significant differences. One of the most significant would be that while insurance in most European places would be compulsory, it was voluntary in Japan. In the Japanese case, the voluntary nature of insurance was the result of strategic decisions, as there were voices that had advocated for the possibility of compulsory system of labor insurance that would offer greater protections to workers. In the arguments for labor insurance, factory owners needed to be forced to support a system that would provide material benefits to workers in the event of an industrial injury or death. They also did not trust workers to voluntarily sign up for life insurance. In this compulsory vision, which was not enacted, the state would be the sovereign force that stood above all to ensure that everyone's interests were balanced. The life insurance systems established by the Japanese post office, however, was voluntary. This made the security available to Japanese workers a commodity that they would need to purchase rather than a right due to them as imperial subjects. This was thus a manifestation of what Takashi Fujitani refers to as the imperiality of freedom, where free choice brought workers into a system of social domination. To intellectuals who supported the postal life insurance system, this was, in fact, the point, as it would force workers to learn the value of savings and regular employment in order to enjoy the security that life insurance would provide. Insurance was thus an important tool for instructing Japanese how to become appropriately modern subjects. Thus, in many ways, the post office's life insurance system does seem to fit well with the standard history of social welfare in Japan, which again argues that the pre-war state largely avoided directly intervening into society. Other elements, however, complicate this. The life insurance industry was tremendously profitable, and it quickly amassed a huge insurance fund. When the system was established by Parliament in 1916, the rules stipulated that the insurance fund would need to be used to invest in social infrastructure. These funds were given out to organizations that would improve public infrastructure, which might include public eateries, pawn shops, public schools, sewers, or roadways. The insurance system also established health guidance stations for customers where they could receive basic health checkups, discounts on medicines, and guidance on healthy living. And as we see in this map, they're really, all throughout the nation and even all throughout the empire. This system of health guidance would also expand, and here's an example of the kind of building that was a health guidance station and the kind of laboratory work that would happen there. This would also expand to Japan's famous system of radio calisthenics, or Dajo Taiso. And so when they created this system, parliamentary officials did not use the term for social welfare, but said that life insurance was a manifestation of social policy, or shakai seisaku. And in fact, the insurance system would never give out loans to individuals, but to groups, and these loans were expected to be profitable. So while the system would end up making a fairly significant intervention into social life in pre-war Japan, it was also very different from how we would traditionally understand social welfare. The system would give huge loans to groups that supported society, but would not make payments to individuals. So in total then, this book is an intellectual and cultural history centered on how insurance aggregated, governed, and commodified lives in pre-war and wartime Japan and colonial Korea. This focus has allowed for close readings of how life insurance rearticulated visions of community and transformed life as an aggregate into a socially constituted object of desire. In each of the 6 chapters, I examine an important issue related to the interplay of discourses of family, community, objectivity, and rationality amid the commodification of Japanese lives under consumer capitalism. And so there are roughly 3 major sections to the book. The first section deals with the establishment of the private life insurance industry. The second moves to the postal life insurance system, including in colonial Korea. And the third looks at the wartime life insurance system. So in the first part, I explore the early history of the private life insurance industry, a period when private firms and intellectuals debated the nature of life insurance and tried to gain consumer trust in their ability to chart a probable future. Insurance companies all touted their systems as a form of mutual aid. However, the means by which mutual aid might be realized remained a subject of intense disagreement. In the different iterations of life insurance I present, readers see how firms came to commoditize the concept of community as they offered alternatives to the mutual aid societies that had developed in the Tokugawa period. The association between life insurance and a new type of consumer sociality remains an important theme throughout the book, and the different chapters all explore different elements associated with the communities formed through the purchase of a life insurance contract. This section also looks at the specific process by which the Japanese life insurance industry created consumer desire for stability and security. To unpack this, I focus on the insurance salesman located at the heart of the nexus of relations that develop between customers and firms, and the ways that they sold a vision of responsible masculinity to middle-class customers. Deploying modern management techniques, salesmen created an enticing portrait of a probable future. Along with this, insurance companies used the uncertain environment produced by the Russo-Japanese War, the Great Kanto earthquake, and subsequent economic depressions throughout the 1920s to spur consumers to look for security in insurance. In doing so, they convinced male customers to defer the satisfaction of their immediate desires and to accept sacrifice in the name of future familial stability and prosperity. In the next section, I focus on the system of kanni hoken, or basic insurance, that was created by the post office in metropolitan Japan in 1916 and later spreads to the colonies. Influenced by European social insurance programs, reformers advocated for a state-run system that would improve the lives of the poor and solve the so-called social problem, which had emerged as a topic of discourse from the 1890s. More importantly, the aggregating nature of insurance promised to bring those poor into the community of the nation. I argue that reformers attempted to use insurance to establish a claim to security as social property, which worked to reincorporate the poor into the realm of the social without challenging the regime of private property itself. Through insurance, intellectuals and Ministry of Communication officials sought to reconstitute the Japanese labor as a self-disciplined subject who, in purchasing a life insurance policy, freely chose to return to the national community. This chapter also demonstrates how life insurance made the poor themselves into a resource base from which the state could fund social welfare projects. Postal life insurance thus became a significant means by which the state distributed funds to groups promoting the public good, while it also further compelled Japanese workers to view security as a commodity that they would need to purchase. This post office would bring this vision of community into the home, first with its health guidance program, which would later expand into the radio calisthenics. And here again is one of the posters. That's the cover of the book from the Daijō Taiso. Influenced by the health promotion campaigns enacted by US firms like Metropolitan Life Insurance, Campo created health guidance stations where they offered basic health services and health checkups to customers. At the health stations, the practice of everyday habits of living became a moral obligation of Japanese citizens as members of the national community. In those life insurance health promotion campaigns, Campo's attempts to suture the problem of labor alienation through the establishment of a national community became ingrained in the bodies and everyday practices of Japanese people. Health promotion should not simply be seen as an example of an interventional state policy, however, as private Japanese life insurance firms also started their own health promotion campaigns in the 1920s and 1930s, in which they sought to use health as a way to recruit customers. Private and public campaigns thus reimagined insurance customers as members of responsible, future-oriented communities attuned to health promotion. In colonial Korea as well, the state tried to position itself as a force that would allow for individual subjects to come together in mutual benefit to establish new types of collective life. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. In the final section, which makes up the last chapter of the book, I discuss insurance during the wartime period. I analyze the relationship between the life insurance industry and wartime expansion. Starting as early as 1931, reformers advocated for nationalizing the industry, primarily to fund imperial expansion. These calls take on greater salience after the outbreak of total war in 1937. And although full-scale nationalization of the life insurance industry or life insurance association never occurred, direction from above increased as the war dragged on and life insurance became incorporated into the control economy, and life insurance firms became important consumers of the government bonds that allowed for Japan to continue to prosecute the war. Ideologues also created a new type of insurance system called the wartime death and injury insurance, to help maintain popular support for the war by managing the fears for the populace and compensating the families of the dead and those at the home front who suffered injuries. In this process, the very legitimate fear of death people might have experienced was, through the purchase of life insurance policies, channeled back into support for the very same effort that threatened their livelihoods. So for the remainder of the talk, I'd like to turn to colonial Korea and the chapter on colonial Korea, as I think this chapter nicely highlights some of the main themes of the book, especially futurity, community, financialization, and the mobilization of society. So as I've noted, the Japanese insurance industry had long connected life insurance with civilizational advancement. The early private firms presented themselves as a force that would teach Japanese consumers how to become responsible modern subjects. The supporters of Kani Hoken, again, basic insurance or industrial insurance, in metropolitan Japan in 1916, had also offered it as a way of instilling responsibility into the lives of the poor and potentially rebellious workers. Insurance required both responsible savings and responsible spending, and the maintenance of regularized labor practices, which function to reproduce labor power. Supporters of insurance also argued that the aggregating function of life insurance would bring alienated workers back into the fabric of the national community. In 1929, the Government General of Korea introduced Chosen Kani Seimehoken, or Korean Basic Life Insurance, which was administered by the Korean Post Office. So through this new system, the Government General of Korea promised to bring stability and responsibility to Korean families, furthering the project of colonial governance. Moreover, through Korean Kanyi-hoken, which was also shortened to Kampo, the Government General of Korea promised to create a vision of communal life where the entirety of the colony would unite in the project of mutual aid. This would take resources out of local mutual aid societies that lay outside of the colonial state's control and bring them under the purview of colonial authorities. As it did in the metropole, Korean Kampo also invested in community welfare organizations. And these investments largely went to organizations that would help to maintain order in rural Korean society. Korean Kanyi-hoken thus worked to enact a system of governmentality that both intervened in Korean life at the level of the rural village, while it simultaneously incorporated these local communities into an imperial community of the insured. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my PowerPoint again. Okay. Apologies for that. I think it should be good. Okay. Is that presenter view on your screen?
I just see like actually the slides on the side too.
You see the slides on the side.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's a bit clunky with Zoom. It's been a while since we've all been using it.
Yeah, you think I'd be better at this by now.
Yeah, well, that COVID experience, and I just forget it all almost.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. Does that work for you?
Not yet. Hold on.
Are you seeing? You're not seeing it?
Nope.
Is that?
Yeah, that's it. Perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, so insurance officials in colonial Korea touted life insurance as a means of enacting the colonial ideology of coexistence and mutual prosperity. This program would thus unite Koreans and Japanese in Korea into a mutually supportive organization that came together and drew from the stability of the colonial state. The colonial state, in other words, had to be the singular presence that guaranteed the stability of the system and ensured that all would benefit. As an official in the Ministry of Communications wrote in 1931, it goes without saying that we should be promoting systems like life insurance that form the basis for a spirit of self-improvement. Further, at the same time that life insurance is a system of self-improvement, it is a modern form of mutual assistance. In insurance, many individuals with an independent spirit cooperate together and collectively defend against the extreme poverty that befalls an individual that meets an unfortunate event. Through insurance, Modi and the colonial state thus vowed to bring Koreans into a larger network of solidarity and to bring security and prosperity to the people. Colonial bureaucrats tried to engage Korean agriculturalists as members of the community of empire, all headed toward a bright future. As it did in mainland Japan, the postal life insurance system enacted social policy by giving out loans to socially useful organizations. Throughout Korean Kampo's history, a sizable portion of loans went to the cultivation and maintenance of peasant self-proprietorship. In supporting the peasant ownership of land, the post office positioned itself as a force for greater class equality. In a report on investments from 1932, Kampo had noted a recent increase in land tenancy and the loss of lands due to debt. Through its loans, the Korean Post Office sought to promote social stability in the countryside by increasing the number of families that controlled small plots of land. Encouraging peasant self-proprietorship was thus one way in which the Korean Post Office would enhance the stability of colonial authority in rural Korea. And here we see this diagram that kind of demonstrates the circulation of resources that the colonial state envisions happening with the postal life insurance system. So basically, consumers would buy a life insurance policy. The state would invest that either through health promotion, which it also does in colonial Korea, or in these different kinds of social welfare organizations that would improve people's livelihood. They would use that to purchase more life insurance. And so it's basically a self-repeating cycle. So from the mid-1930s on, Kampo would even more directly intervene in the lives of rural villages through its model village system. In February of 1933, the Korean Post Office had initially designated one village as a superior village, and this designation evolved into the model village system as it expanded through the 1930s, along with the increased emphasis on rural revitalization. As a result, by 1937, 163 villages have been designated as either model villages or superior villages. So the Mohan Buraku designation was supposed to reward villages that avoided protests or other forms of social disruption, and where a majority of households enrolled in Kanyi Hoken. The post office encouraged continued participation through incentives such as the gifts of livestock animals and other implements useful for farming villages. The head of the insurance section in the Department of Communications described the model village system as an example of the ways that the government general of Korea was helping Koreans, the majority of whom were peasants, to fully realize peace and prosperity under colonial rule. In the Mohan Buraku, the village itself became the party responsible for the collective security of all. One representative would collect the insurance premiums for the village and then give the village's entire payment to the post office. More significantly, the post office encouraged villagers to engage in collective labor. According to bureaucrats, this collective labor encouraged people to think of the village as a space of mutual support, while it also provided villagers with funds to pay their premiums and improve their livelihoods. While the aggregating function had always been central to insurance, the Mohan Buraku system expanded this practice, making the collective also now responsible for paying premiums and managing rewards. In this way, the model village system was a living embodiment of the Korean Post Office's vision of mutual prosperity under the authority of the colonial state. The designation of Mohan Buraku would thus reward villages that avoided disputes and focused on the economization of all aspects of life. However, colonial administrators did not want Korean peasants to envision assistance as welfare or aid. Instead, the colonial Korean Post Office sought to reward local villages that had already begun the process of helping themselves. The post office would provide planning expertise as well as a loan or a gift incentive to help the villagers begin the process of development. But the success was supposed to depend on the hard work and responsibility of the villagers themselves. For example, the post office would often reward Mohan Buraku with an ox or a clock, both of which were thought to improve the village's productive capacity. And here we have a poster that has the Hoken Ushi, or the Hoken cow or Hoken oxen, the insurance, cow or oxen. And so in this way, postal life insurance's Mohan Buraku system sought to expand on the colonial state's mission of inculcating labor, market-oriented production, and responsibility into the everyday habits of Korean villagers. As an extension of their responsible economic activities and as a result of their hard work, the villages were expected to purchase insurance contracts. These hardworking and responsible villages would then be able to receive assistance in the form of an insurance payout in the event of a tragedy where a member died. Responsibility and hard work, in other words, would bring them into the community of the colony as responsible subjects, after which they could benefit from the assistance of their fellow imperial subjects. In the Mohanburaku, Korean peasants could only benefit from the biopolitical impulse to make live to the extent that they were willing and able to reconstitute their leisure time as a space that could be further hollowed out by colonial capitalism. So this brief discussion of Korea exemplifies much of what I've tried to do in the larger book. The book as a whole tries to bring attention to the myriad projects through which the state, both the state and private insurance companies, utilize life and community as commodities, while also examining the simultaneous role played by utopic hope and the fear of uncertainty in inciting consumer desire. While community as an aggregate social body became something viewable as a coherent object, the ends to which this object might be applied could differ depending on historical context. Life insurance thus highlights the important role that statistics and numerical data played in transforming life into an aggregate object. The post office used the clearly delineated object of society when enacting health or social reform programs. The creation of the aggregate social body of consumers also facilitated the expropriation of value from consumer lives. Life insurance is not simply a story of the triumph of rational bureaucratic systems, however, since individual firms and the state itself use different affective visions of community to incite consumer desire. The fantastical vision of the predictable future thus helped to organize Japanese lives into a governable object while also helping to generate consumer desire for a life insurance policy. While the life insurance industry generally portrayed itself as offering a rational response to the contingency that always awaited individuals and to which no single individual could ever adequately respond on their own, the book discusses the ways in which tensions played out between individual precarity and security within the aggregate of the insurance community.